Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the Elric Saga Volume 1 and Volume 2, written by Michael Moorcock. These are the Saga Press editions, which came out this year in celebration of Elric's 60th anniversary. Elric first appeared in a novella called The Dreaming City in 1961, which was published in the Science Fantasy magazine starting number 47. He is the epitome of the doomed hero. People often describe him as an anti-hero. I personally wouldn't use that description for him. He does a lot of heroic things. So I would say he is the doomed hero, not doomed anti-hero. He exists in a sword and sorcery world. He is written to sort of be like the anti-Conan the Barbarian. So who is Elric, for those who don't know? Elric was the last emperor of a dying race called the Melnibonians. And the Melnibonians are an eldritch, non-human race who think and feel very different to human beings. They don't have the same emotions that human beings do. They are amoral. A lot of what they do is considered cruel. They are hedonistic. And when we enter the story, they had ruled the world for over 10,000 years. But these past 500 years, their empire has stagnated and shrunk, and now their empire mostly consists of one small island where they spend most of their time taking drugs, going on dream quests on their dream couches, torturing their slaves for fun, and just being themselves and nasty and things like that. So Elric is very unusual for a Melnibonian. Apart from being an albino, as you can see from the cover art, he is also he's very sickly and weak. So he relies on alchemical potions and things to keep him mobile and alive, and just to keep his strength so that he's able to get up and walk. He needs to take these potions regularly, and as such, he's become very reliant on sorcery and magic, and has become one of the most powerful sorcerers in the world. That is until he finds his black rune sword, Stormbringer. Stormbringer is a sentient black sword that sucks the souls out of people that Elric kills with it, and then feeds that energy into Elric. And when Elric does this, he no longer has to rely on his potions to get up and about. But Stormbringer has a nasty habit of killing people nearest and dearest to Elric, so that causes all sorts of angst and drama. Why Elric is so unusual for a Melnibonian is he was cursed with this thing called a conscience that most Melnibonians don't have. Elric becomes a little bit obsessed as to what morality is, and wants to find out what does it mean to be moral. And the way he decides to go and investigate this is to go and travel around the world and visit the young kingdoms and mix with the humans and see if he can figure out what is morality, and if he can somehow bring morality to Melnibone and save his stagnating, dying empire. And when he does this, he leaves his cousin in charge as regent. And this turns out to be a terrible idea, because his cousin is a typical Melnibonian and takes advantage of Elric's absence and takes over while he's gone. And I'm not spoiling too much what will happen when Elric eventually returns. So the reason I got into Elric of Melniboné was I was looking for something for my roleplay group at the time. We were looking for something fantasy, but we weren't into Dungeons and Dragons, and I found the Stormbringer role-playing game by Chaosium. It didn't really pick up with my group, but it did introduce me to the books. I picked up the 1993 omnibus editions. So this is how I first encountered it. And the stories in there were published in the same order as these, which is chronological order. Now, the stories were not written in chronological order. They were written jumping around through Elric's timeline. So the first story, The Dreaming City, is Elric returning to Melnibone after a long absence. And then eventually the prequel is written showing Elric as Emperor of Melnibone. So I didn't read it in the order they were written and published. I read them in this order, which is Michael Moorcock's preferred order, chronological order. So we start with Elric as Emperor. He then leaves, goes on adventures, he comes back, and so on. This is actually a really good order to read it in. It makes it a nice, good, coherent story. So these are the Saga Edition versions. They're advertised as illustrated. They do have a few, very, very few illustrations. The end papers are maps of the Young Kingdoms. I don't think we've had color maps like this before in the novels. In my paperback versions, there were some black and white maps, I think. I'll have to dig them out and take a look on both ends. This also includes a foreword by Neil Gaiman, but it's not actually a foreword at all. It's his short story, One Life Furnished in Early Moorcock, which is a short story which has been published in many other books. I mean, there's even a comic version of it as well. It's one of Neil Gaiman's most autobiographical stories. I think he calls it the story that's not a story. So it's not really a foreword, but it is a nice story by Neil Gaiman too. Also included in here is a reader's guide to Elric by John Davey, which goes through every single edition of the different novellas, short stories, fix-up novels, and omnibuses. So there are 2 black and white illustrations in each book. There's usually like one at the right at the beginning and one right at the end, before the reader's guide. And then in the middle, we've got some color plates. None of these pictures are new. They've all been in other editions before, usually as a cover. So we have seen them before, which is a little disappointing. Also, I would have liked them interspersed throughout the book rather than just put in the middle and at the end. So that's volume 1. So volume 2. There. The other cool thing about Elric is he isn't just Elric. Elric is an aspect of the Eternal Champion. And the Eternal Champion is an entity that exists in every universe throughout the multiverse. And what this means is that every story that Michael Moorcock has written, whether it is a fantasy or a science fiction or contemporary fiction, the main character is usually an aspect of the Eternal Champion. And sometimes the Eternal Champion can remember things from other lives that he's had. So Elric might have a dream about being someone else, and usually that someone else is from another story. Sometimes, through the ability of multiversal travel, the champions can meet each other, which is sort of like meeting themselves, almost like in Doctor Who when a doctor meets a previous regeneration. So eternal champions like Hawkmoon and Corum and Ericose can sometimes cross over with Elric, and they can go on an adventure together. And what I found particularly cool when I first read these, so there's a story in the fix-up novel Sailor on the Seas of Fate, where Elric meets Hawkmoon and Ericose, and they go on an adventure into another universe. And then I was reading a Hawkmoon novel in the Count Brass omnibus, and I thought, I've read this before. And that's because I was reading the same story again, but this time from Hawkmoon's point of view, and that's particularly cool. And then the same thing happens again in Volume 2, in the Vanishing Tower, the story is called, where Elric meets Corum again. And then in one of the Corum books, the same story again, but this time from Corum's point of view. And that sort of thing I had not really encountered before, reading the exact same story from a different character's point of view, even though technically they're kind of the same character. So the Eternal Champion is sort of the idea that every hero is really the same hero, which, Joseph Campbell, the hero with 1,000 faces, or was called. So it's this takes it that step forward. So early Elric stories tend to take place within the Young Kingdom's very sword and sorcery. Some of the later ones tend to go a little bit into the multiverse. He'll travel to other universes, meet other versions of himself, other eternal champions. The thing with this being published in chronological order and not in the order they were published in, some of the stories were written decades apart, and Michael Moorcock's writing style did change quite a bit between them. So sometimes you'll be reading a very early story, which is very sort of typical sword and sorcery fantasy, and then the very next story will suddenly be all philosophical and talking about parallel universes and higher beings and things like that, and it feels almost different. And then suddenly you'll jump back again to 60s pulp adventure story. That's the only thing. That being said, reading it in chronological order makes a very coherent story from beginning to end. It's the way I first read it, and I really enjoyed it like that. So, and there's no spoilers in the stories written later for the ones written earlier. Anything it does work in this order, and this is the author's preferred order to read the stories in. That being said, while these are written in chronological order, there is a volume 3 coming out from Saga Press, and this is going to have the last 3 novels that he wrote in the early 2000s, which are known as the Dream Quest trilogy, which involved Elric's children. And this, although it's chronologically could be considered after these, really most of it happens concurrently with the final book in here, which is Stormbringer. And one of them happens a bit earlier than that. So we're getting out of chronological, but it doesn't really matter because that most of what happens in those 3 happens during a dream quest where Elric is sending his mind into the multiverse, and he finds himself mostly in our world during the 1930s and 40s. We've got Elric versus Nazis, which is a lot of fun. And there's a lot of crossover with another Eternal Champion called Von Beck, who we've discovered is very much related to Elric anyway, apart from being an Eternal Champion. So those are a lot more As I said, they were written in the early 2000s. They're much more modern, a lot more philosophical, and tend to take place more in our world than in the Young Kingdom, the Young Kingdoms, the sword and sorcery world. But they're also a lot of fun. But also, very excitingly, Saga Press is releasing another novel, a brand new Elric novel being written by Moorcock right now. It's going to be released in December this year. And this is considered an early Elric story. It's obviously new, so it's not written early, but it's set early in Elric's career. I believe they're saying it's set in between Volume 1 and Volume 2, so it's like a 1.5 novel. It's called The Citadel of Myths. It's coming out in December, and I can't wait to read a brand new Elric novel when it comes out.